The man behind the bid table did not bother to write her name down. He looked at Nora Briggs the way a man looks at someone who has already lost. And he said, sold, like the word cost him something. 480 acres of the worst dirt in Crail County, Texas. She paid cash. The other bidders did not clap. They did not shake her hand. A few of them laughed, quietly, the kind of laughter that travels sideways through a crowd, passed from one mouth to the next like something contagious. A man in a green John Deere cap leaned toward his neighbor and said something Nora could not hear. His neighbor nodded slowly, the nod of men who had already decided how a story ends. Nora picked up the deed from the table, folded it once along the crease, and slid it into the inside pocket of her canvas jacket. She did not look at the laughing men. She walked out of the Crail County auction house into the flat, white glare of a February morning, got into her 2004 Ford pickup, and drove south toward the land she had just bought. She had been back in Crail County for 11 days. The Harker Flats sat at the bottom of a long, gradual slope where the county road dropped away from the plateau and flattened into a basin that collected heat in summer and cold air in winter and very little else of value. The locals called it dead ground. They had been calling it that for 20 years, since the Harker cotton processing plant shut down in 1999 and left behind 80,000 gallons of industrial runoff soaked into the basin floor. Mercury, cadmium, lead compounds in concentrations that the state environmental agency had measured twice, flagged twice, and then quietly deprioritized both times because the cleanup cost was estimated at $3 million, and Crail County did not have $3 million. 3 men had tried to farm it. The first one, a wheat grower named Denton Pruitt, lasted 18 months before the soil tests broke him. The second, a man who came down from Oklahoma with money and optimism, lasted 1 full season. He planted sorghum and got stalks that turned black at the base and fell over in July. The third man did not even finish plowing before he walked off the property and never came back. The land sat in county receivership for 6 years, accumulating back taxes, until the morning Nora Briggs raised her hand at the auction and no one else did. She pulled her truck off the county road onto a gravel track that ran along the eastern fence line and stopped where the track ended at a rusted gate with a chain and a lock that had seized solid with rust. She climbed through the gap between the second and third fence rails the way she had climbed through fences since she was 8 years old, and she stood inside the boundary of her land and looked at it. The ground was pale gray, not the gray of ordinary dry soil, but a hard mineral gray, almost metallic in the winter light, as if the earth itself had given up any pretense of being alive. The surface was cracked into irregular plates, each one curled slightly at the edges from decades of contraction and expansion. Nothing grew on it, not scrub cedar, not mesquite, not the stubborn dryland grasses that colonized every other neglected field in the county. The contamination was thorough enough that even the weeds had given up. Nora knelt down and pressed her palm flat against the surface. It was cold, not just the cold of February air, but the deeper cold of ground that had not held warmth in a long time. She could feel the faint mineral roughness of the cadmium crust under her fingers. She stayed there for a moment, her hand against the dead ground, her eyes moving slowly across the 480 acres of ruin she had just spent her remaining savings to purchase. Then she opened the brown leather notebook she carried in her jacket pocket and wrote down the temperature, the date, and a single phrase she had written at the top of the first page of every notebook she had kept for the last 4 years. It is already here. We simply have not looked in the right place. She had 11 sample sites marked on a hand-drawn map she had sketched from memory and satellite imagery. She spent the next 6 hours moving between them with a soil coring tool and a set of sealed collection tubes. She worked without stopping, without eating, without looking up at the pale sky or the distant line of Wade Holden's green, irrigated fields on the ridge above her. She labeled each tube in her precise small handwriting, packed them into a foam-lined case in the bed of her truck, and drove back to the small house on the edge of Harkertown where her brother Cole was waiting. Cole Briggs was 19 years old, and he moved like a man twice that age. The disease had been working on him for 2 years by then, a progressive neurological deterioration that the specialist in Austin had described with careful clinical language that translated, when Nora stripped away all the softening. To this, the pathways between his brain and his legs were closing, slowly and without reversibility, and there was currently no treatment that could stop it. He had learned to manage the unsteadiness with a wooden cane their father had left behind, a thick piece of Osage orange wood, smooth and dark from years of handling. Cole was sitting on the porch when she pulled up, the cane resting across his knees, a cup of coffee going cold in his hand. "How bad is it?" he said. "Worse than the photos," Nora said. She sat down on the step below him and pulled off her work gloves. "Better than I needed it to be." Cole looked at her for a moment. He had their father's eyes, dark brown and direct, the kind that did not look away from things. "You found it," he said. It was not a question. "I found the conditions for it," she said. "I will know more in 48 hours. Cole nodded. He picked up his coffee, looked at it, set it down again. The Harker cotton plant had been the economic engine of Crail County for 60 years before it shut. Their father had worked the maintenance line there for 19 years. Their mother had grown up 3 miles from the flats. Nora had left Crail County at 17 on an academic scholarship, gone to Texas A&M for her undergraduate degree, then to the University of Illinois for her doctorate in soil microbiology, then to a research position with the USDA in Washington, D.C., that had lasted 4 years and ended badly. Cole had been born when Nora was 15, the second child of a second marriage, and she had watched him grow up from a distance, visiting in summers, sending money when she had it, calling every Sunday. When their mother died in 2017 and the disease appeared in Cole 6 months later, Nora had driven back to Crail County on a Thursday in October and had not gone back to Washington. She had been building toward this for 4 years before that drive home. The work had started as academic curiosity, shifted into obsession, and by the time Cole got sick, it had become something else entirely, something with teeth. The research had begun with a paper she had read during her second year at USDA, a 40-page study from a soil scientist published in an obscure microbiology journal. The paper described a class of subsurface bacteria found in geothermal zones and heavy metal-contaminated industrial sites, organisms that processed metallic toxins as an energy source rather than being destroyed by them. The paper had been cited 3 times in the decade since its publication. Nora had read it 11 times. What that researcher had observed in the field, Nora had spent 3 years working out in the laboratory. The class of bacteria he described produced, as a metabolic byproduct, a set of organic compounds that had no established classification. Nora had given them a working name in her notebooks, regenerative neural precursors. The name was imprecise and she knew it, but what she had observed in preliminary cell culture studies, run in a rented laboratory in College Park after her USDA termination, suggested that the compounds interacted with damaged neural tissue in ways that existing science had no framework to explain. She had never published any of this. The reason she had never published was the reason she had been terminated from USDA. In 2015, during her 3rd year at the agency, Nora had submitted an internal research memo to her division director, a document outlining preliminary evidence of the bacterial compounds and requesting a formal research budget to pursue the work. The memo had been classified as internal correspondence and filed. 3 weeks later, she had been called into a meeting with the division director and 2 men she did not recognize, neither of whom offered their names or institutional affiliations. The meeting lasted 22 minutes. She had been told that her memo contained speculative claims inconsistent with established soil science, that pursuing the research further would be a misuse of agency resources, and that she would be wise to focus on her assigned portfolio. She had not focused on her assigned portfolio. 6 months after that meeting, she had documented and reported to the agency inspector general a pattern of data manipulation in a soil contamination study being conducted on behalf of a private agricultural corporation. The report had been received, acknowledged, and buried. 4 months after that, she had been terminated for performance deficiencies that her annual reviews had never once suggested. She had not known, at the time, the name of the agricultural corporation whose studies she had exposed. She had learned it later: Meridian Agricultural Solutions, a subsidiary of a larger holding company whose board of directors overlapped in two places with the federal division that had overseen her termination. Meridian Agricultural Solutions had been acquired 3 years prior by a larger entity operating out of Dallas under the name Consolidated Farmland Partners. It was not until Nora began searching county property records during her first week back in Crail County that she learned Consolidated Farmland Partners had a regional office in Dallas under a trade name it used for direct agricultural acquisitions. That name was Rex Decker Agriculture and Land Management. She did not tell Cole any of this on the night she returned from the Harker Flats with her soil samples. She made dinner, helped him with his physical therapy exercises, listened to him talk about a book he had been reading, and after he went to sleep, she sat at the kitchen table with her sample case and her notebooks and worked until 3 in the morning. The samples confirmed what she had driven 2,000 miles and spent her last $40,000 to find. The bacterial colony was present, not in the surface crust, but at a depth of 14 to 22 inches, concentrated in the zones of highest cadmium saturation. The contamination that had killed every conventional crop attempted on the Harker Flats for 20 years had, in the process, created the precise chemical environment required for the bacterial colony to establish and persist. The poison had built a home for something that had no other home. She sat for a long time after she recorded the results. Outside, the February wind moved against the windows. The town of Harker was completely quiet at that hour. 12 blocks of feed stores and a gas station and a diner and houses with porch lights left on out of habit. She had found what she came for. Now she had to grow it. The deliveries began in the second week of March. Nora had arranged them through a network of contacts from her university years and her USDA time, researchers and suppliers she trusted and who knew enough about her work to ask no questions. The trucks came at night, long-haul rigs that turned off their running lights on the county road and rolled slowly down the gravel track to the gate she had rehung with new hardware. The drivers unloaded and left within the hour. The contents of the deliveries were not the inputs of conventional agriculture. There were sealed drums of processed volcanic basalt flour, finely milled to a particle size specified in her notebooks. There were cartons of sealed culture medium flasks, temperature maintained in portable coolers. There were rolls of heavy black geotextile fabric, the kind used in industrial erosion control. There were specialized low-temperature lighting arrays on collapsible frames. And there were, in a refrigerated unit on the last truck, 40 sealed containers of inoculant culture, each one labeled in her handwriting with a date, a sample location number, and a temperature range. She had been cultivating the inoculant for 4 months in the College Park laboratory before she left for Texas. It had cost her a year of careful work and the last of a small inheritance from her mother. Nora worked alone on the Harker Flats every night from 9 until 4 in the morning, under the halogen light arrays, wearing a half-face respirator and heavy canvas coveralls. She dug trenches at specific intervals according to a grid she had marked with survey flags. She lined each trench with a layer of basalt flour mixed into the existing soil at a ratio she had calculated over 3 years of preliminary work. She inoculated each prepared trench with the culture medium and covered the rows with the black geotextile fabric, staked at precise intervals to prevent lifting in the wind. The fields, viewed from the county road in daylight, looked abandoned. The black fabric stretched across the gray ground like a series of long, dark shadows. There was nothing to see and nothing to smell, nothing to indicate that anything was happening. Mabel Cobb saw the trucks. Mabel had not slept well since her husband Raymond died in 2014, and she had developed the habit of sitting at the window table of her diner in the hours before she opened at 6, drinking the first pot of coffee and watching the county road. She had seen the trucks on 3 separate nights before she mentioned it to anyone. When she did mention it, She told Darla Fitch at the feed store, and Darla told her husband, and by the end of the week, the story had made the usual circuit of the town. The general opinion of Harker was that the woman who had bought the dead ground was hauling in something either illegal or insane, and that either way she would be gone before summer. Wade Holden heard the same stories, but his reaction was different from the town's. Wade operated from the top floor of a two-story ranch house on the ridge above the basin, and he had been watching the Harker flats with genuine attention since the morning of the auction. Wade was 71 years old, and he had spent 40 of those years acquiring land in Crail County through methods that were always legal and sometimes barely so. He had taken Mabel Cobb's 200 acres in 2009 through a loan acceleration clause that her husband had not read carefully enough. He had taken 3 other properties through similar mechanisms over 15 years, 7 farms in total, each one absorbed quietly into his holdings while the families involved moved away and the county records showed nothing irregular. He had been waiting for the county to absorb the Harker Flats tax default so that he could pursue the subsurface water rights underlying the basin, rights that a geological survey he had privately commissioned in 2016 had confirmed were significant. The arrival of Nora Briggs was an obstacle. Wade was experienced with obstacles. He called Rex Decker on a Wednesday evening in the 3rd week of March. Rex operated his land acquisition business out of a glass-fronted office on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Dallas, and he answered his phone with the practiced ease of a man who had learned that his voice was one of his primary professional assets. "I need a number put in front of someone," Wade said. Rex came to Harker on a Tuesday in early April, driving a silver Land Cruiser that collected the county road dust on its lower panels and looked expensive and out of place in the parking lot of Mabel's Diner, where he stopped first to ask directions. Mabel gave him directions and watched him drive south toward the flats with an expression she did not bother to conceal. Nora met him at the gate. She had seen the silver vehicle coming down the gravel track from a quarter-mile out and had put down her tools and waited. Rex Decker was 44 years old with the confidence of a man who had rarely been told no by anyone who could not afford to tell him no. He wore a blue canvas jacket that was trying to look casual about its expense. He smiled at Nora with warmth that was entirely professional. He introduced himself. He told her he represented interests that were serious about land acquisition in the region. He named a number. It was double what she had paid at auction. Nora looked at him for a moment. She was aware that he had come within 3 weeks of her purchase. 3 weeks was not enough time to evaluate the Harker Flats through conventional agricultural analysis. There was no conventional agricultural analysis that would produce a number double the auction price for contaminated ground that had defeated 3 previous owners. He already knew something. The question was how much. "I am not selling," Nora said. Rex kept the smile in place with visible effort. He talked for another 3 minutes, adjusting the offer structure, adding language about flexibility and partnership arrangements and forward contracts. Nora listened without expression. When he finished, she said, "I am not selling," again, in the same tone she had used the first time. Rex left. He did not look at the flats as he turned the Land Cruiser around in the gravel. He was already looking at his phone. That evening, Wade Holden invited Nora to dinner at his ranch house on the ridge. The invitation came through a hand-delivered note left at her rented house in town, written on heavy cream stock with the Holden Ranch letterhead embossed at the top. The note was polite and specific, naming a time and offering a home-cooked meal. It read like something a man sends when he wants to be perceived as reasonable before he stops being reasonable. Nora went. The ranch house was large and carefully maintained, the interior decorated with the accumulated objects of a man who had lived in the same place for 40 years and knew the value of appearing rooted. Wade met her at the door himself. He was a big man who had been bigger, the frame still there but carrying its age honestly. He shook her hand with both of his and led her to a dining room where household staff had set 2 places at one end of a table that could seat 12. The meal was good. Wade talked about the county, about the history of the basin, about his father and the land his father had built. He was a skilled conversationalist, and he knew it. He did not mention the flats directly until the plates were cleared. Then he named a number significantly larger than Rex Decker's number. He said it with a slight pause afterward, the pause of a man who expects the weight of something to do his work for him. Nora drank the last of her coffee. She set the cup down carefully on the saucer. She looked at Wade Holden across the table. "Thank you for dinner," she said. She stood up, picked up her jacket from the back of the chair, and walked out. She heard him say something behind her as she reached the hallway. She kept walking. It was the first week of April when Mabel Cobb and Nora first occupied the same silence. Nora had come into the diner at 5:45 in the morning, before opening, because she had seen the light on from the street and had not eaten since noon the previous day. She knocked once, and Mabel let her in without comment and pointed to the window table. Nora sat. Mabel put a cup of coffee in front of her and went back behind the counter and began her opening preparations. They did not speak for 20 minutes. The coffee was strong, and the diner was warm, and outside the county road was empty and pale in the pre-dawn light. Nora wrapped both hands around the cup and looked out the window at the road and said nothing. When Mabel finally set a plate of eggs and toast on the table without being asked, Nora looked up. "You knew Raymond Cobb." Nora said, "Your husband." 41 years, Mabel said. She went back to the counter. Nora ate. Mabel opened the diner. The first customers came at 6:15 and looked at Nora with the sideways curiosity of people who had been talking about someone. Nora did not look back at them. She left a 20 on the table and walked out into the morning. She came back the next day at the same time, and the day after that. On the fourth morning, Mabel sat down across from her with her own coffee, uninvited, and they sat in silence together until the first customer came. It was not friendship yet. It was something quieter than friendship, and in some ways more durable. In mid-April, on a night when the temperature dropped to 38 degrees and the wind came hard out of the northwest, Nora was alone on the Harker Flats making adjustments to the corner stakes of the geotextile when she noticed something she had not expected to see for another 2 weeks. Along the edge of the northernmost trench, where the fabric had been pinned back for a moisture test, a series of very small forms had pushed through the surface of the prepared soil. They were dense and low, each one no larger than the end of her thumb, and in the beam of her headlamp they had a quality she had no precise word for. Not green, not purple, a color that existed at the edge of both and committed to neither. She knelt in the cold dark and looked at them for a long time without touching them. The wind moved across the basin, and the halogen light swayed slightly on their frames, and the 480 acres of the Harker Flats lay around her in the dark, silent and enormous. She opened her notebook. She wrote down the date, the time, the air temperature, the soil temperature at 2 inches, and the exact position of the trench relative to her grid markers. Then she wrote one more line. "It is here." She drove back to town after 2 in the morning. Cole was asleep. She made herself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the wall for a while. His cane was leaning against the doorframe of his bedroom. The Osage orange wood was dark and smooth in the low kitchen light. She looked at it for a moment. Then she opened her notebook again and began calculating the next phase of the work. There was no time to feel anything that was not useful. The growing season in Crail County was exactly what it was. The timeline was exactly what it was. She worked until dawn came through the kitchen window, and the county road outside began to carry its first traffic of the day. And the diner light came on 2 blocks over, and the town of Harker woke up knowing nothing about what was growing in the dead ground to the south. The days after the first growth were quiet, in the way that things are quiet before they stop being quiet. Nora adjusted the fabric stakes, recorded her measurements, and said nothing to anyone. Cole noticed the change in her the way younger siblings notice things, not through what she said, but through the quality of her silence, which had shifted from the taut silence of waiting into something steadier, the silence of a person who has found the ground under their feet and is learning its weight. He did not ask her about it directly. He made coffee in the mornings and left a cup on the counter for her, and they moved through the small house on Harker's Edge with the careful choreography of two people who understood each other well enough not to need constant confirmation of it. Mabel watched Nora come into the diner each morning and noticed the same thing, though she would not have described it the same way. What Mabel saw was that the young woman had stopped checking the door when she came in, the way a person stops checking their back when they have decided they are not being followed. Mabel said nothing about this either. She filled the coffee cup and went back to her work and let the mornings be what they were. What none of them knew, in those last quiet weeks of April, was that Rex Decker had not gone back to Dallas to forget about Nora Briggs. He had gone back to make a phone call. May arrived in Crail County with the cruelty of a Texas spring that had decided not to be spring anymore. The temperature climbed past 90 by the second week, and the humidity dropped to nothing, and the sky turned the pale, hammered white of a season skipping straight from cool to brutal. The irrigation canals on Wade Holden's ridge fields were running full capacity by May 15th. His farm manager reported that the winter wheat was holding, but the alfalfa in the southern sections was already showing stress. Wade watched the weather reports every evening from the leather chair in his study, and the numbers he watched were not temperature numbers. They were water table numbers. The subsurface aquifer beneath the Harker Flats Basin was, according to the geological survey Wade had commissioned 3 years prior, the largest undocumented freshwater reserve in the southern half of Crail County. The survey estimated a sustainable draw yield of 400 gallons per minute. Wade's existing wells on the ridge were pulling 220 gallons per minute, and the summer projection showed a deficit before August. The Harker Flats were not just land to Wade Holden. They were the water under the land, and the woman farming them was sitting on top of a resource she did not know existed and would not know how to use, even if she did. That was what he had told himself in February. He was becoming less certain of it by May. On the third Saturday of May, Nora pulled back a 12-foot section of geotextile along the central trench for her scheduled growth measurement and stood for a moment without writing anything in her notebook. The plants had changed. In the 4 weeks since the first emergence, the growth had proceeded along the curve she had projected, steady and dense and low to the ground. But in the past 10 days, something had accelerated. The plants that had been thumb-sized were now covering the prepared soil in a continuous carpet, their leaves broad and deeply colored, a bruised dark green at their centers, shading outward to that borderline between green and purple that the morning light made look like a metal sheen. The root systems, when she probed gently with her coring tool, had extended to a depth her timeline had not predicted for another 3 weeks. She ran her soil temperature probe into the ground at the center of the trench. The reading was 4 degrees warmer than the ambient soil temperature at the same depth outside the planted rows. The bacterial colony was metabolizing at a rate she had not modeled. She stood in the May heat with her probe in the ground and recalculated the timeline in her head and understood that the harvest window she had planned for October might need to move to late August. She spent 2 hours taking measurements before she covered the row again. When she was done, she sat on the running board of her truck and drank water and looked at the black fabric stretching across the gray ground in every direction and felt something she had not permitted herself to feel in a long time, which was the specific quality of fear that comes not from failure, but from success arriving faster than you are prepared for it. She called a number she had not called in 14 months. The man who answered taught soil biogeochemistry at Texas, A&M, and his name was not important to anyone outside his field. But to Nora, he was the one person whose scientific judgment she trusted completely. She had studied under him for 2 years during her doctorate, and he had written one of the 2 letters that got her the USDA position, and he had called her the week after her termination to tell her carefully that he believed her, and that he was sorry, and that he could not publicly say either of those things. She told him what she had measured. She gave him the numbers without context or interpretation and let him work through them in silence on his end of the line. When he spoke again, his voice had a quality she recognized from seminars, a tightening she had heard before only when he encountered data that did not fit. That metabolic rate is not possible in a cadmium-saturated environment, he said. I know. Nora said. Send me the raw soil profiles, he said. The full column, not just the surface. I will send them tomorrow, she said, and I need you to hold on to something for me. She drove to Harker, went to the post office before it closed, and mailed a padded envelope to the Texas A&M address. Inside was a sealed inner envelope, double-taped along every edge, containing photocopies of her primary research notebooks from 2015 through the present, a complete chain of custody documentation for every sample taken from the Harker flats, and a signed letter from Nora asking him to keep the envelope unopened until she contacted him with specific instructions. She had already mailed an identical envelope to a patent attorney in Austin, whose name she had found through a former USDA colleague. She had done this in March, 10 days after Rex Decker's first visit. She went back to the diner. Mabel was closing up when Nora came through the door, turning chairs onto tables. She looked at Nora's face and turned one chair back down and went to get the coffee. They sat across from each other in the half-dark of the closed diner, and Nora told Mabel about coal, not about the research, and not about the bacterial colony, and not about the compound she had spent 4 years working toward. She told Mabel about a 19-year-old boy who had their father's eyes and their mother's stubbornness, and who had been told by a doctor in Austin that the pathways between his brain and his legs were closing, and that there was nothing in established medicine that could stop it. She told Mabel about Cole teaching himself to manage the cane so smoothly that people who did not know him sometimes did not notice. She told Mabel about the Sunday calls from Washington, D.C., and the guilt that had accumulated over years of being somewhere else, and the drive back from D.C. in October 2017 that she had understood somewhere in central Arkansas as the drive she was not coming back from. Mabel listened without interrupting. She had the quality of stillness that comes to people who have spent decades behind a counter listening to things that had nowhere else to go. When Nora finished, Mabel looked at her for a moment. Wade Holden took my land with a piece of paper. Mabel said, Raymond signed something he did not read, and Wade had a lawyer who had read everything. I have thought about that piece of paper every day for 10 years. She paused. Whatever you are growing out there, you make sure you have better paper than he does. It was the most Mabel had said to her at one time. Nora looked at her across the table. I am working on it, Nora said. June arrived, and the drought settled in like something that had decided to stay permanently. The National Weather Service issued its first exceptional drought classification for Crail County on June 9th. The county agent sent a letter to all registered agricultural operators advising water conservation measures. The irrigation canals on Wade Holden's fields ran through the nights now as well as the days, and the sound of the pumps on the ridge carried in the still air all the way down to the basin floor. On the Harker Flats, the geotextile fabric was gone. Nora had begun rolling it back in sections during the first week of June as the plants reached the canopy density she had targeted. What lay beneath the fabric, revealed in long strips as she worked her way across the grid, stopped her each time despite the fact that she had been watching it build for 2 months. The plants had achieved full ground cover across every prepared row, a continuous low canopy of dark-centered leaves with that metallic sheen intensifying now in the heat. Between the planted rows, the ground itself had changed. The pale gray mineral crust was gone. In its place, the soil had turned a dark brown that held moisture visibly, a rich loam color that should not have been possible in the top 6 inches of ground that had been clinically dead 3 months before. The bacterial colony was not just surviving in the contaminated soil, it was consuming the contamination and leaving behind a soil matrix more biologically active than anything Nora had measured in her career. The cadmium levels in the treated rows had dropped 61%. The mercury was down 44%. The lead compounds were sequestering in the root systems of the plants themselves, bound into the cellular structure of the stalks, in a form that the colony's enzymes had rendered chemically inert. She was running out of ways to describe what she was seeing in language that felt adequate to it. The town of Harker had been watching since the fabric came off. People slowed their trucks on the county road when they passed. Darla Fitch drove out one afternoon on the pretext of checking a fence line that had nothing to do with her and parked at the road shoulder and looked at the dark green canopy for a while before driving back. The man in the John Deere cap who had laughed at the auction came past twice in 1 week. Nobody came to the gate. Nobody asked Nora directly. The looking was the kind that kept a careful distance. The looking of people who are not yet sure whether what they are seeing is something to be explained or something to be warned about. Wade Holden did not slow down when he drove past. He stopped completely on a Tuesday morning in the second week of June and sat in his truck with the engine running for several minutes looking at the Harker Flats from the road's shoulder. His farm manager was in the passenger seat and said nothing. Then Wade drove on. That evening, he called Rex Decker, and the conversation lasted 40 minutes. Rex arrived in Harker on a Thursday with two men Nora had not seen before. They were not introduced, and they did not introduce themselves. They waited in the Land Cruiser while Rex walked to the gate where Nora was waiting, having watched them come down the gravel track from the road. Rex's presentation had changed since April. The professional warmth was still there, but it had thinned to the point of transparency, and underneath it was something that had no interest in being mistaken for warmth. He placed a document on the flat top of the gate post. He told Nora it represented a legal finding by Consolidated Farmland Partners regarding a clause in the 1987 sale agreement for the Harker Flats tract, a clause that granted the original purchaser's successor entity's right of first refusal on any commercial agricultural development of the property. He told her that her current activity on the land constituted commercial agricultural development under the definition in the clause, and that the right of first refusal had therefore been triggered. He told her the buyout price being offered was the 1987 appraised value. The 1987 appraised value of the Harker Flats was $11,000. Nora picked up the document. She read it. She read it a second time. Rex watched her with an expression calibrated to suggest regret while communicating finality. She set the document back on the gatepost. "I will have my attorney review this," she said. Rex nodded in the manner of a man who has heard that sentence used to delay the inevitable. He picked up the document and left a copy, and walked back to the Land Cruiser. Nora stood at the gate until the vehicle had turned around and driven back down the gravel track to the road. Then she took out her phone and called the attorney in Austin. She knew the clause was either fraudulent or stretched far past its original intent. She also knew that legal challenges take time and money, and that time was the one variable in her situation she could not afford to waste. The harvest window was narrowing. The compound concentration in the root systems was still building toward the peak she needed. Every week the legal process consumed was a week that brought Cole closer to the next threshold the specialist had described. She did not sleep that night. The drought deepened through late June into July. The county agent issued a second advisory. 3 of Wade Holden's southern alfalfa fields went into emergency fallow. His farm manager reported a water table drop of 6 feet in the primary ridge wells in 60 days, a rate that no prior summer had produced in the station records going back to 1974. And on the Harker Flats, in the basin below the ridge, Nora's fields were doing something that defied the drought so thoroughly that it had stopped being a curiosity and become something that made people in Harker uncomfortable in a way they could not name. The plants were not just surviving the exceptional drought, they were visibly swelling with it, their root systems pulling from the deep saturated layer of the aquifer at a depth that conventional agricultural roots could not reach. The soil temperature differential, maintaining a microclimate in the root zone that the surface conditions could not touch. The canopy had thickened. The leaf color had deepened further into that metallic dark quality that caught the harsh July light and held it differently from any green thing in the county. And at the base of each stem, where it met the soil, a slow seeping of a dark reddish substance had begun, drying on the soil surface in irregular patterns and releasing a smell that concentrated in the evening heat into something sharp and layered, like copper and warm earth, and something faintly sweet that had no precise comparison in the memory of anyone who encountered it. Wade Holden stood on his back porch with binoculars on a July morning and looked at the dark canopy on the flats below and did not recognize the emotion he was feeling as fear, because he had not felt it in a long time and had forgotten what it was called. He called Rex Decker. Rex told him about a man he knew named Callum Hayes, who worked for Consolidated Farmland Partners in a capacity that was not on any organizational chart. Hayes arrived at Wade's ranch the following Tuesday evening. He had a face that remembered nothing and forgot nothing, and he came carrying a folder and no pleasantries. He was a lean man in his early 50s who dressed like a contractor and spoke like a man accustomed to rooms where the consequences of conversations were understood without being stated. He brought with him a soil scientist named Ellis who wore wire-rimmed glasses and carried a brushed aluminum sample case. They had analyzed the 3 extracted specimens. Hayes said Ellis had identified the primary compound. The filing was ready to submit. "There is one problem," Ellis said. He set the sample case on Wade's dining table and opened it. Inside were 3 plant specimens, sealed in transparent preservation bags. The cellular structure of the compound is bound to the root matrix in a way that degrades without the host soil environment. The samples we have show what the compound is, but not how it is produced. To file a complete patent claim, we need the bacterial culture itself, not just the plant derivative. "That is in the soil," Hayes said, looking at Wade. "It is in the soil of a specific contaminated zone at a specific depth," Ellis said. "The surface specimens alone are insufficient for a full industrial patent. We need a soil column sample from the active root zone, at least 18 inches deep, taken from within the planted area." Wade was quiet for a moment. He looked out the window toward the south. "She has cameras now," he said. Hayes nodded. "We know." He paused. "The cameras cover the perimeter. They do not cover the access point at the northwest drainage culvert. The culvert runs under the fence at the property's low corner. The opening is large enough." Wade looked at him. "What you are describing," Wade said, "is a soil sampling operation," Hayes said, "in the dark, on property whose legal status is currently under dispute. The dispute has not been adjudicated," Wade said. "No," Hayes said, "it has not." Wade looked at the bags in the sample case, at the plants inside them, still holding their color even in the sterile preservation environment. That dark metallic green he had been looking at through binoculars for 2 months. He nodded. What Hayes did not know, and what Wade did not know, and what Rex Decker, sitting in his Dallas office, did not know, was that the northwest drainage culvert was the first location Nora had flagged when she installed the trail cameras. Not the last, the first. She had spent 3 nights in June lying in the dark on the grassy slope above the culvert, watching the way the land lay and thinking about the directions a person would approach from if they wanted to avoid the obvious entry points. The culvert was not obvious. It was the route a person would choose who had studied the property from satellite imagery and knew the fence line well, but had never walked the ground at night. She had mounted a camera inside the culvert mouth, aimed outward, powered by its own dedicated battery pack, connected to nothing else on the property. It was the one camera she had not told the attorney about. It was not for the attorney. The night Hayes chose was a Wednesday in the 3rd week of July. The moon was 3 days past new, and the basin was dark enough that the stars made the only visible light on the flat ground. Hayes had 2 men with him in addition to Ellis. They came in a single dark-colored truck parked a 1/4 mile up the county road and walked the rest of the way, using red filtered headlamps that were invisible past 50 yards. They found the culvert exactly where the satellite imagery had shown it. The opening was a 4-foot concrete drainage pipe, dry in the drought, running under the fence and emerging inside the property boundary. They went through one at a time. Ellis went last, carrying his sample case. Inside the property, the planted canopy was visible as a darker mass against the dark sky, the leaves catching starlight in a way Ellis had not expected, and which stopped him for a moment at the culvert mouth, sample case in hand, looking at it. Then he followed Hayes toward the nearest planted row. Hayes directed his men to the row's edge, and Ellis knelt in the dark with his coring tool. The smell was strong here, fully concentrated at ground level, and the soil under his gloved hands was warm in a way the air temperature did not account for. He worked the coring tool down through the root zone, through the 12 inches of active bacterial layer, and withdrew a complete 18-inch column of soil from the heart of Nora's planted field. He held it up in the red headlamp light and looked at it, and what he saw made him turn to Hayes without meaning to. "There is something in this soil that is alive in a way I have not seen," Ellis said. His voice was lower than it had been in Wade's dining room. Hayes looked at the column. The bacterial layer was visible in cross-section, a dark band of extraordinary density in the middle of the core, and even in the red light the material had a quality of activity that was different from inert soil chemistry. "Bag it," Hayes said. "All of it." Ellis sealed the core in 3 layers of preservation bags. Hayes signaled the 2 men and they turned back toward the culvert. They were 12 feet from the culvert mouth when every light on the Harker Flats came on simultaneously. Not the portable halogen rigs Nora had used in the spring, something else entirely. Nora had spent 4 days in the second week of July running wire from the property's electrical meter, which she had upgraded to commercial service in March, to a series of fixed floodlight fixtures mounted on 8-foot posts driven into the ground at the perimeter of the planted area. The posts were not visible in daylight from the road. The switch for the entire array was a single circuit breaker in the meter box at the gate. She threw it from the gate at the moment Hayes's team turned back toward the culvert. The 480 acres of the Harker Flats went from complete darkness to full commercial illumination in less than a second. Hayes froze. His 2 men froze. Ellis, still holding the bagged soil column, turned completely around twice before stopping, disoriented by the sudden light. From a position on the slope outside the northern perimeter fence, where she had been lying in the dry grass for 3 hours, Nora watched them through the fence with a video camera running. She stayed on the slope. She kept the camera level. She documented. She held it steady and recorded Hayes standing in the middle of her planted field in the full glare of the floodlights with a man holding a soil column taken from her root zone, and she held it there for 40 seconds. And then she picked up her phone with her other hand and called 911. The Crail County Sheriff's deputy arrived 19 minutes later. His name was Thomas Webb, a 29-year-old who had grown up in the county and knew the Harker Flats by reputation. He found 3 men standing inside a perimeter fence on private agricultural property at 2:30 in the morning, one of them holding a sealed sample case, one of them with soil on his gloves and a coring tool in his hand. He also found Nora at the gate with a video camera, a printed copy of the property deed, and a calm that he would later describe to his supervisor as the calmest he had ever seen anyone be while reporting a crime. Hayes gave the deputy a business card and a speech about legal dispute and property access rights. Deputy Webb looked at the business card and looked at the deed Nora had given him and looked at the coring tool and made the calculation that any man with functional judgment would make. He took Hayes's name and the names of the 2 men. He confiscated the soil column as potential evidence under criminal trespass statutes. He told all 3 men to leave the property. Ellis did not speak during any of this. He looked at the dark metallic canopy of the planted field under the floodlights, and then he looked at Nora once, standing at the gate, and he looked away. They left. Nora stood at the gate after the deputy's cruiser had followed them to the county road. The floodlights were still running, and the field lay under them in full illumination, the leaves catching the artificial light the same way they caught the sun, holding it differently from any other growing thing in the world. The smell that had been her constant companion for months was fully present in the night air, and the silence of the basin was complete, except for the faint sound of her own breathing. She turned off the floodlights. She stood for a moment in the dark. Then she called her professor at 3 in the morning and told him she needed the envelope contents formalized into a sworn deposition before the week was out. He said he would do it that day. Patricia Sloan filed in federal court on a Friday morning. 11 days before Nora had told Mabel she needed, the filing documented the priority date established by the March postmark, the complete chain of custody for all research data from 2015 forward, the criminal trespass incident with attached video and deputy report, and a secondary claim that Consolidated Farmland Partners had obtained its knowledge of the bacterial compound through a confidential internal USDA memorandum, access to which constituted misappropriation of federally classified research. That last element had come from Patricia, not Nora. Patricia had subpoenaed the USDA personnel files relevant to Nora's 2016 termination as part of a parallel wrongful termination action she filed simultaneously, and what she found in those files was not ambiguous. The meeting in 2015 with the two unnamed men had been attended by a deputy division director whose calendar, obtained through a records request, showed a meeting with a Consolidated Farmland Partners executive that same week. The connection was not subtle. It had been buried under 4 layers of bureaucratic filing, and it had stayed buried because no one had looked for it until now. The federal judge in Austin issued a temporary restraining order against Consolidated Farmland Partners within 48 hours of Patricia's filing, prohibiting any patent application based on materials derived from the Harker Flats pending a full evidentiary hearing. Rex Decker's patent filing, which had been submitted 4 days before Patricia's action, was placed in administrative hold. Rex learned about the hold on a Monday morning and called Wade Holden. Wade's response, in the quiet of his study on the ridge above the basin, was to look out the window at the distant dark canopy of the Harker Flats and say nothing for a long time. His farm manager knocked and entered while he was still looking. "The South Creek wells are down another 4 feet," the manager said. Wade said nothing. The manager waited. Then he left. The harvest came in the first week of August, 10 days ahead of Nora's original timeline. She had arranged the extraction equipment through her Texas A&M contact, and it arrived in 2 unmarked refrigerated trucks on a Tuesday night. What Nora had designed was quiet, because she had designed it to work rather than to be witnessed. The autonomous subsurface extraction units, small enough to fit in a backpack, ran along the prepared rows in the dark and removed the root systems cleanly without severing the bacterial colony from the host matrix, sealing each extraction in a nitrogen environment maintained at 4 degrees Celsius. The work took 11 hours. When it was done, the Harker Flats were empty. The plants were gone. The geotextile was gone. The light rigs were gone. What remained was 480 acres of soil that was, for the first time in 20 years, not dead. The cadmium readings Nora took from 6 points across the field on the morning after the harvest were down 81% from the February baseline. The mercury was down 67%. The soil itself, tested in the same portable unit she had brought in February, registered a biological activity index that was, as she told her professor when she called him that morning, higher than any topsoil she had measured in 15 years of fieldwork. The Harker Flats were alive. The contamination that had killed 3 farmers and poisoned the ground for 2 decades was not gone. Not entirely, but the process consuming it was irreversible now. The colony had established itself across the full depth profile of the basin soil. Without the plants to draw from, the bacterial layer would continue its work at a slower rate, but it would continue. In 2 years, the field would be plantable by conventional means. In 5 years, the soil scientists from Texas A&M who accompanied the harvest team and took their own measurements that morning were quietly projecting it would be among the most biologically productive ground in the county. They did not say this loudly, but they said it. Nora was sitting on the tailgate of her truck when her professor walked over and stood beside her, looking at the field. "You should have published in 2015, he said, not as a criticism, as a statement of fact about a world that had not been ready." "I know," she said. "They will try to minimize what this is," he said. "In the journals, in the patent proceedings. There will be a period where the institutions work to absorb it slowly enough not to be embarrassed by how long they ignored it." I know that too, she said. He looked at her for a moment. You are not worried about that. Nora was quiet. She looked at the empty field, at the dark, changed soil stretching away in every direction. Some answers did not need to be spoken to be understood. She closed her notebook and set it on her knee and let the August morning settle around them both. Cole walked in a straight line without the cane for the first time in 14 months on a Thursday morning in September. It was not a recovery. Nora did not use that word because the specialist in Austin had told her not to use it yet, that the improvement in his nerve conduction metrics over the 6 weeks of the trial protocol was significant and reproducible, but that the word recovery required more time and more data. What the specialist said instead was that the pathways that had been closing were stable, that the direction of the process, which had been moving one way for 2 years, had reversed. Cole did not know that Nora was watching from the kitchen window when he stood up from his chair, set the Osage orange cane carefully against the wall, and walked the length of the hallway and back. He moved slowly and with concentration, the way a person moves when they are not certain of the ground but have decided to trust it anyway. He got back to his chair and sat down. He looked at his hands for a moment. Then he picked up the cane and put it across his knees in the familiar position and went back to the book he had been reading. Nora turned away from the window and went to the sink and ran the water cold and stood there for a while with her hands under it and her eyes closed. And whatever she was doing in that moment, she did not need anyone to see. The federal hearing took place over 3 days in late October. Patricia had prepared for it with the thoroughness she brought to everything, which was considerable. The priority documentation was clear. The chain of custody was unbroken. The video from the culvert incident and Deputy Webb's report established that Consolidated Farmland Partners had engaged in criminal trespass to obtain research materials from a property whose ownership was not in legal dispute, only whose development rights were, a distinction that the federal judge noted with visible attention on the second day of the hearing. The USDA connection was the element that changed the hearing's character on the third day. The deputy division director, whose calendar had shown the 2015 meeting with Consolidated Farmland Partners, had retired in 2018 and was not present. But the documentary record Patricia entered was sufficient. The judge ordered a separate referral to the USDA Inspector General's office for investigation of potential federal research misappropriation. Rex Decker was in the gallery on the third day. He sat in the back row with the stillness of a man who has watched the architecture of a plan collapse from a distance and is calculating what can be salvaged. The patent application Consolidated Farmland Partners had filed was formally invalidated by the court's ruling on the priority date. The temporary restraining order was converted to a permanent injunction. Wade Holden was not present at the hearing. He was in Harker, in the offices of the Crail County Board of Commissioners, where a closed session had been called that same week. The details of what was discussed in that session were not immediately public, but the outcome was posted on the county website 2 days later in the brief institutional language that governments use when they are recording things they would prefer not to have to record. Wade Holden's appointment as Honorary Agricultural Commissioner of Crail County, a position he had held for 11 years and used as a platform for every land acquisition he had made in the county during that time, was rescinded by a vote of 4-1. The one dissenting vote was a commissioner whose family had bought property from Wade 3 years prior at a favorable price. The 4 who voted to rescind did not explain their votes publicly. They did not need to. Rex Decker closed the Harker regional office of his operation in November. His Dallas practice continued in a reduced capacity. The Consolidated Farmland Partners holding company began a restructuring process that its public filing described as a strategic realignment and that Patricia described, when Nora called to ask, as a company trying to move its assets before a federal investigation could freeze them. Nora did not know whether that effort would succeed. It was no longer her concern. On a morning in early November, she drove to the Harker Flats for what would be one of her last visits to the field before the winter set in. She parked at the gate and walked through without climbing the fence, because she had installed a proper gate in August, and stood inside her land in the November air. The field was bare now, the plants harvested, the rows visible only as slightly darker lines in the turned soil. But the soil itself was the thing. She crouched and pressed her hand flat against the ground the way she had done on the first February morning. And what she felt was not the mineral cold of dead ground. What she felt was the warmth of active biological process, the faint living heat of a colony doing its work in the dark layers beneath her hand. Quietly and without any requirement that anyone acknowledge it, she stayed there for a moment. The November wind moved across the basin, and the sky was the high, clear blue of a Texas autumn, and somewhere on the ridge above her she could hear, very faintly, the sound of Wade Holden's pumps running, drawing from a water table that was a little lower than it had been last year and would not be replenished by any rain the season was currently offering. She stood up. On the way back through Harker, she stopped at the diner. The morning rush was over, and only 2 tables were occupied. Mabel was behind the counter refilling a napkin dispenser with the focused efficiency of a person who has done the same task thousands of times and still does it completely. She looked up when Nora came in. Nora sat at the window table. Mabel brought the coffee without being asked and set it down and started to go back behind the counter. Then she stopped. She looked at Nora for a moment. "How is Cole?" she said. "Better," Nora said. Mabel nodded once. She went back behind the counter. Nora drank her coffee and looked out at the county road, at the flat November light on the familiar street she had grown up knowing and left and come back to. After a while, Mabel sat down across from her with her own cup, the way she had started doing in April, and they sat in the quiet of the diner in the mid-morning lull. 2 women in a window, watching a county road that looked the same as it always had and was not, in every way that mattered, the same at all. Before she left, Nora put something on the table, a small padded envelope, sealed, her handwriting on the front. She put on her jacket and picked up her keys. Mabel looked at the envelope. "What is this?" she said. Nora was already at the door. "GPS coordinates," she said, "for a point in the Harker Flats, southwest corner, near the old property marker." Mabel looked at her. "Your land," Nora said. "The 200 acres Wade took in 2009. I had the soil tested out there last month. The bacterial colony has spread to the western edge of the basin on its own. It does not need to be planted. It is already working." She opened the door. "What am I supposed to do with that?" Mabel said. Nora looked back at her once. "Whatever Raymond would have done," she said. She walked out into the November morning and got in her truck and drove south out of Harker on the county road, past the flat where the dark changed soil lay under the pale sky, past the fence line where new wire had replaced the cut section, past the gate with the proper hardware, and kept driving. The field was quiet behind her. The county road was empty ahead of her. The work she had spent 4 years building toward had found its ground and taken root, and she had learned, in the months of doing it, that the most important things do not announce themselves when they begin. They begin in the dark, at depth, in conditions everyone else has given up on, and they work without stopping. And one morning the person who planted them presses a hand to the ground and feels the heat coming up and understands that something irreversible has happened. That is not a victory. It is simply what work looks like when it has been done completely. She drove toward the highway with the morning sun at her back and did not look in the rearview mirror.